the way we represent ourselves online has devolved from the quirky, personalized HTML web page, homepage of the 90s, to the somewhat modular but still strange presence of a MySpace page, to the completely formatted and market-friendly presence of a Facebook page. What we've done is moved from personal, human, open-ended self-expression to completely market and computer-friendly, regimented and conformist expression. And that's because we've turned the net from a venue for self-expression to a way to render ourselves up onto the market.
Every single time we go online, every time we look at a website, every time we send an email message, every time we make a phone call with our mobile telephones, we're exposing ourselves, we're stripping ourselves naked to the view of anybody who is interested to find out what we're doing. We know already that private agencies are keen to look at the pattern of use of the internet that we indulge in so that they can target advertising at us. And governments in the Western world, indeed in the world at large, are anxious to keep a record of who people are talking to, what kind of information they're finding out, so that they can detect patterns of, that suggest crime or terrorism in the offing. And in all these ways, therefore, we expose ourselves to view through the use of these devices. Not that we would want to give up using these devices, they're just so useful to us, but they do expose us to scrutiny. Every single day that we do something digital, we are potentially leaving a trace out there, and that if somebody wanted to find out where we were shopping, what we were doing, who we were communicating with, why we were doing it, what websites we were logging onto, they could do it. It's a very, very exposed set of media, these electronic communication devices that we now use. And the point is that they're fantastically convenient. None of us would willingly give them up. But what we would want, if we really thought carefully about what it meant whenever we use these devices, we would want much, much greater individual security for our communications.
There are a variety of threats to privacy online. The worst case scenario would be when information about a person is collected by a large, powerful institution, whether public or private, whether government or corporate, in a way that is used profoundly to their disadvantage, and where the individual has no control over the usage of that information. So it could be to conduct surveillance on people, and in fact, it is so much easier now to collect so much more information about what people do, what they read, what they see, what they buy, that in the hands of a government that has no respect for civil liberties, if you can imagine the sort of post-9/11 world run amok, there's an enormous threat that it would be used to silence political opposition and political opponents and enforce a kind of authoritarian regime. That's the scenario I worry about.
Google knows what you're interested in right now. Do they know who you are? Do they have a profile of you? Not in any real sense. But they are watching as you click. But because we trust Google to watch for the right reason, which is to give us better results, we're okay with this.
It's hard to say just how valuable personal information on the web is. I think that most companies would rather have cash to start with, but the information is coming to them almost for free. That is, your clickstream data just comes to the website, comes to advertisers without your actually having to do anything other than just going and clicking on things. So it's a very, very cheap and unobtrusive form of currency. I mean, probably the best thing about it is that it is so unobtrusive. You don't know you're giving it up, and so it seems entirely free to you.
that means all this stuff is free. No, it doesn't mean it's free. It means we need to now develop an economic platform capable of dealing with a distributed, decentralized value creation economy. Google on the internet serves almost the same function as the World Bank in the globe. In other words, Google talks about everything being free, open source, and all shared. Google wants every system to be open. But what Google really wants is every system to be open to Google so that Google can serve ads through every piece of technology. The same way that the World Bank says, oh, we want to give money to all these developing nations as long as they open their markets to first world activity. That means we're going to give them money so that they allow a factory to be open on their land. We're going to give them money so they have the privilege of paying us back with interest. And that's not just openness. That's openness to a certain thing. So I must applaud the Google Android and this great system, and it's going to be on phones and all that, but they want to be open for a reason. They understand that because they do basically have a monopoly right now on information and on the way it's spread, on the way it's categorized, the way we understand it, that the more open systems they can have, the fewer boundaries that anyone is allowed to erect to anything, then the fewer boundaries there are to Google.
But that is what we're doing online. We are clothing ourselves in data, unawares, and we are being judged as we're walking around the internet by who the cookies say we are, and who we declare we are by our Facebook profile or our Twitter stream or what information we put into whatever website we might go to. Some of us are more aware than others that this is occurring. Most of us honestly have no idea, and if it got turned off tomorrow, would be upset because all of a sudden the services we had wouldn't be as good because Amazon wouldn't know what they know about you and eBay wouldn't know what they know about you, and for whatever reason, when you went to your favorite news site, the content you got wasn't customized to who you are, and so on and so forth. We're not aware of the information shadow that we cast and the response to that shadow that occurs automatically now. But as a culture, we are going through that process right now, and it's fascinating. I think it's important. It's as important as an agrarian shift to urban. I think this is as big a deal, and it's accelerated.
So as people are actually learning how to use social technologies, they are using them in all sorts of ways. So of course, social technology is going to have a massive impact in terms of how people organize politically, what they do economically, and how they express themselves as being unique individuals in a social way.
How aware are you, or how aware do you think people who use Twitter, your account holders, are of the privacy implications for what they put up on their public profiles?
I think we're still figuring that out. I mean, like I've said before, we're 10 years into this idea of the open exchange of information first through blogging and now with Twitter. And people are trying to figure out and discover what the right amount is still. There are some people that go over and then, get burned and realize, okay, well, that wasn't the right way. And then there are people who do it sort of just right, and they get all these great opportunities presented to them that they hadn't thought of before. So I think the short answer is we're trying to explore and figure out with our electronic communications. We're trying to add nuance, subtlety, things that we don't have right now in email and IM. And that's what we're seeing, not just with Twitter, but all over the web. All this great stuff that's emerging in social media is people trying to find new, interesting ways to communicate, become more efficient, become more engaged, become more informed. And I think it leads ultimately to having more empathy, to understanding more about what's happening with other people, and sort of putting yourself in their shoes more often.
That's interesting you say that, because I've heard a theory that, that people won't trust people in the future. Say they run for political office, if they don't have that exposure, if they haven't thrown themselves all up online, because they won't have that track record. People will say, well, why not? What were you trying to hide? And do you think that that's that is an aspect of naivety. Do you think I'm naive because I'm part of this culture, that I think, well, our our concepts have shifted so much?
The concepts are shifting, but we always have to take into account privilege. Who has privilege in the system and who doesn't? Right? I have the great privilege to be able to say, this is who I am, you will deal with me like it or not. But I'm in a very particular position, professionally, socially, etc. There are a lot of people for whom that's not true. And the classic example that everybody can reach out to, or can make sense of, is the teacher, right? The teacher we think of as a perfectly reasonable character in our lives. But the teacher is supposed to have a big boundary between what they do in the classroom and what they do elsewhere, right? And for example, sex is not supposed to enter the classroom, and yet teachers have a right to have a sex life. They're old enough to be allowed to drink and it not be an issue. And so what happens when their students get to see access of their personal lives in another context? How is that used to shift the power roles in the classroom? And for many teachers, it's a point of deep struggle and frustration, right? What does it mean to be on an online dating site and your students track down your profile that was never meant for them, where no name was ever explained, but it was meant to try to live a life outside of the classroom? And what happens when it gets interpreted by those teenagers' parents of like, what are you doing? Why do my kids have to see you dating? And that becomes a really interesting boundary problem.
The one thing that keeps coming up is this idea of the exchange of private information. How are kids exchanging or using private information as currency in a different way than perhaps adults are using private information as currency?
Well, again, what constitutes private information, right? From an adult's perspective, it's identifying information is their absolute fear, right? The idea that it's your name, your address, your phone number, anything that will identify you. And this has to do with the idea of physical risk. But for young people, it's about all right, fine, you can call me by my name. Why is that a big deal? It's more about the things that make you vulnerable. And so when we think about privacy and private information, it's really a question of vulnerability. And so from adult perspective, we're really concerned about physical vulnerabilities, and increasingly about psychological vulnerabilities. And for a lot of young people, it's about social vulnerabilities. So, how do I make certain that I don't get teased, harassed, bullied because of the things that I make available out there? How do I make certain that what I put out there makes me seem cool and not lame? How do I balance that? So the social vulnerability is the privacy fight for young people. The physical and psychological is the fight for parents. And so we see these two constantly at odds, because part of putting things out in public is to achieve status, you need to actually make yourself vulnerable at a certain level. And how do you actually do that in a way that balances the risks and the benefits?
Sherry, how is this generation different in terms of how much we give to other people in terms of our information?
Well, I think this generation has a sense that information wants to be free, and information about themselves wants to be free. And in a way, there's a kind of self-surveillance that I think that young people don't think about in political terms. But it is a political issue. People put their lives on the screen. They put really intimate details of their lives out there, and with very little thought that there might be people using that information in ways that are not benign. And it's also hard to teach the relationship between intimacy and privacy. What is intimacy without privacy? I think this is really a question for this generation.